Good afternoon. I am back to reading Sacred Sorrow by Michael Card, and we are starting the third section, part 3, and it will be about David. The name of it again is Sacred Sorrow, about lamenting. These are going to be chapters about David's lament. Chapter 10, Hunger-Born Songs of Intimacy. From the beginning, David was no stranger to pain, and in the end it was the process of lamenting his pain that led him to an unheard-of intimacy with God. From his pen flowed the intimate words of suffering that Jesus would one day use in giving voice to his own pain on the cross. Through the words of those laments, God would redeem a mountain of sin and spiritual suffering. Through his psalms of lament, as perhaps nowhere else in Scripture, David reveals a God who uses and utilizes everything, especially pain. All true songs of worship are born in the wilderness of suffering. It is the pen of pain that writes those songs that call us forth to dance. David, like no one else, suffered and danced throughout the stumbling course of the rocky terrain of his lonely life. From the beginning, David lived a solitary life, cut off from the intimacies you and I take for granted. Before he even drew a breath, birth order was against him. He was the youngest of 8 brothers. The complicated dynamics of family that we are only now beginning to understand would have worked against the young boy. Children born first and even second tend to receive more attention and favor from their parents. Children born last, as was David, are listened to the least and tend to develop more than their fair share of emotional problems, such as depression. But our greatest strengths are always our greatest weaknesses, and so, conversely, last-born children develop early in life a hunger for intimacy that can become either an asset or deficit, or sometimes both at once. Perhaps it is this interior hunger that causes more last-born children to be drawn to the intimacies of art and music. David, as we shall see, responded to this tug as well, and at some point early in his life picked up the harp. When we first see him, David is alone and forgotten, tending his father's sheep in, of all places, the wilderness. When Samuel comes looking for God's anointed, no one in the family considers David to even be a remote possibility for kingship. In fact, the lonely truth is, no one considers David at all. When we come to know his 7 strapping brothers, we arrive at the distinct impression that, had it only occurred to them, they might have sold their younger sibling, just as Joseph's brothers had done some 8 centuries earlier. In Judaism, a rabbi purposely avoided talking to his sons about anything but the Torah until the boys were 12 years old. The reason given is so they can learn to walk around inside themselves. Though his father Jesse was no rabbi, David knew the terrain of this interior wilderness and wandered there all his days. What followed was a life of growing up in the wilderness. The emotional wilderness he experienced in the midst of his family, but more significantly, the actual wilderness of the hills around Bethlehem. A deserted place which would later shape the boyhood of Jesus. 15 stories come to us from the Bible of David in the wilderness. There he faced his bitterest enemies, among them Goliath and the Philistines, 1 Samuel 17. He came to know death on a scale you and I can scarcely imagine, 1 Samuel 27, verse 9, 2 Samuel 8, verse 10. In the wilderness, we are told he would weep aloud until he had no strength left to weep, 1 Samuel 30, verse 4. When later he would lament, "My soul thirsts for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water," Psalm 63, 1. David's words sprang from a thirst for intimacy with God that could have only been shaped by the desert desolation of the wilderness. It was there he learned how much he needed God. It was there he learned God's worth, and so it was there he learned worthship. This was the obscure beginning of an intimate relationship with God that would give shape and meaning to his life, his kingship, and eventually the life of a nation. The wilderness-born gift of hunger for intimacy with God is echoed in all our yearnings for relationship as well. Sometimes it leads us away from the source, and we look to others to fill that God-shaped place in our souls. At one point in his lonely life, David sought such illicit intimacy from Bathsheba, and the consequences almost destroyed him. But God, who uses everything, can use even illegitimate longings to draw us eventually toward more legitimate relationships. Here we experience finite reflections of a deep satisfaction that only knowing him can provide. David found such reflections in his intimate friendship with Jonathan. By rights, they never should have been friends in the first place. After all, the throne should have gone to Jonathan, the son and heir of Saul. If ever there was a genuine reason for jealousy, Jonathan possessed it in spades. But Jonathan seems to have been deeply repulsed by his father's hatred for David. He witnessed its poisonous results and determined that he would not follow the same dark path. What he offered to David was precisely what Jesus would command from his followers 1,000 years later. Enemy love, another illuminating translation for chesed. Indeed, when David later lamented the death of Jonathan, chesed was the word he would use to describe the love they shared. David had found a singular friend in Jonathan. But no friend, no soulmate, no spouse could ever fully fill the divine dimensions that echo in our soul's need for intimacy with God, for his presence, for chesed. In the wilderness, the stark severity of David's life pressed him to make one of two choices: avoid the forsaken sense of suffering it causes and find a substitute for intimacy with God, or stubbornly refuse to let go of the loneliness and continue on the path toward an ever-increasing, continuously painful, unheard-of intimacy with God. David's two choices are still our only ones today. Chapter 11 will be next.